I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from the deepest wounds my own family inflicted. As a successful founder of a massive national logistics empire, I thought I had secured our future, but I was completely wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up with nothing in the harsh winters of Chicago meant I wanted to give my son everything I never had. But inside our sprawling modern estate, a chilling emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our massive home with its manicured lawn, heated swimming pool, and luxury cars was a fortress of heavy expectations I thought my son Derek would eventually meet. I handed over my entire company to him, expecting him to care for the family and honor the legacy my late wife and I built. But what I discovered changed absolutely everything. I was sitting at a chipped Formica table in a dusty roadside diner in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. I was supposed to be looking over structural reports for an abandoned warehouse facility I was planning to acquire. It was a routine inspection, just a temporary distraction, to keep my mind off the unbearable fact that my daughter-in-law Maya had burned to death in a horrific car crash back in Chicago exactly 6 months ago. I was about to ask the tired waitress for a glass of ice water when I froze completely. The woman approaching my table was heavily pregnant, moving with a slow, deliberate, and painful caution. She wore a faded baseball cap pulled down low and a blue surgical mask covering half her face, but I knew those eyes instantly. I stood up so fast, my heavy chair scraped loudly against the cracked linoleum floor. She gasped loudly. The plastic tray slipped from her shaking hands, and thick glasses shattered into 100 jagged pieces across the floor. Her mask slipped down past her chin. It was Maya. I reached for her, a strangled cry catching in my throat, but she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. She grabbed my arm, her grip bruising my skin, and whispered in a broken, desperate voice, "Please, Richard, do not tell him I am alive." What she said next made my blood boil and turned my heavy grief into a cold, hard rage. I grabbed Maya by the elbow, ignoring the diner manager shouting angrily about the broken glass, and pulled her out the back door into the narrow alleyway. The brutal Nevada heat hit us like a physical blow, smelling strongly of hot asphalt and rotting garbage. "Maya," I gasped, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I held her thin shoulders. "We buried you. We had a closed casket funeral. My son Derek has been falling apart for 6 months." The mere mention of my son made her physically recoil. She pulled away from me, wrapping her arms protectively around her swollen belly. "He has not been falling apart, Richard," she spat out the words, harsh, jagged, and full of venom. "He is probably celebrating right now." I stared at her completely, uncomprehending the words coming out of her mouth. "What are you talking about, Maya?" The police report clearly stated the car lost control on the highway. It was a tragic, terrible accident. She did not let me finish my sentence. With trembling hands, she slowly rolled up the sleeves of her oversized flannel shirt. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Her forearms were covered in thick, angry, ropey burn scars, the kind of terrible scars that never let you forget what you barely survived. "It was not an accident, Richard," she whispered, looking frantically up and down the empty alleyway, as if she expected a hitman to jump out from behind the rusting dumpsters. The brake lines were intentionally cut. I felt them give out completely when I hit the steep exit ramp on the interstate. I barely managed to throw myself out of the driver's side door before the car hit the concrete embankment and went up in a massive ball of flames. I tried to process what she was saying, but my mind was stuck on a terrible, impossible contradiction. "But they found a charred body in the driver's seat," I said, my voice barely recognizable to my own ears. The dental records matched perfectly. We held a massive funeral. I stood in the rain and watched my son cry over that dirt grave. Maya shook her head, heavy tears streaming down her face, cutting clean tracks through the thick dust on her cheeks. "I do not know who was in that car, Richard. I swear to God I do not know who burned in my place. But I know exactly who cut those brakes. I heard him talking on a hidden burner phone the night before it happened. Derek was planning it all along. He was planning to murder me. My old knees went weak. I had to lean heavily against the hot brick wall of the diner to keep from collapsing onto the dirty pavement. My son. Derek. The boy I had groomed for 30 long years to take over Harrison Logistics, the massive empire I had built from a single flatbed truck into a national corporate powerhouse. I had retired just 2 years ago, handed him the coveted keys to the kingdom, completely expecting him to care for our family, to honor our proud name. Why, I asked the single word, feeling like coarse sandpaper ripping through my dry throat. Why would he want to kill you? Maya looked down at her worn sneakers, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Because I found out about the money. The massive amounts of money he was moving through the corporate accounts. He set up a memorial charity right after he took over the company, supposedly for cancer research. But the numbers did not add up. I am an auditor, Richard. I saw the glaring discrepancies. I saw millions of dollars flowing in from anonymous shell companies and flowing right back out to untraceable offshore accounts. I told him I was going to tell you everything. I told him he had to stop immediately. I felt a dark coldness spread rapidly through my chest, entirely freezing out the blistering Nevada heat. I was looking directly at my daughter-in-law, who was carrying my unborn grandchild, hiding in a filthy alleyway 3,000 miles from her home because she was utterly terrified of my own son. And she was standing there telling me that my son was not only a corporate thief but a calculating murderer. I looked deep into her eyes. She had always treated me with far more genuine respect than my own son ever had. I knew in my soul she was telling the truth. The horrifying implications slammed into me like brutal physical blows. We could not stay here. We had to move fast. The absolute war for my family had just begun. I swore quietly to myself that my son would face justice. I would burn his criminal kingdom to the absolute ground to protect this innocent child. I drove us through the dead of night. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the ragged, shallow breathing of the woman sitting beside me. Every time a pair of headlights washed over the interior, Maya flinched, shrinking down into the leather seat. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. We crossed the state line into California just as the sun began to bleed a pale gray light over the horizon. My off-the-books cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road near Lake Tahoe, hidden behind a dense wall of ancient pine trees. I had purchased the property 20 years ago through a blind trust and a shell corporation, originally intending it to be a quiet retreat for fishing. Derek did not know it existed. He did not know the LLC, he did not know the location, and he did not have the keys. It was a fortress. I pulled the car into the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. Maya sat completely still, staring at the rustic wooden structure, as if she could not believe she had finally stopped running. I walked her inside, unlocked the reinforced door, and turned on the backup generator. The cabin was stocked with canned goods, bottled water, and enough firewood to last months. I set her up in the main bedroom, locking the heavy deadbolt behind us. I told her she was safe now. I told her no one would ever find her here. She collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, burying her face in her scarred hands, and wept until she had no tears left. I stood in the doorway, watching my daughter-in-law tremble. She was carrying my grandchild, the only true continuation of my bloodline, and she was forced to hide like a hunted animal. I promised her I would handle everything. I gave her a prepaid cellular phone programmed with only one number, and told her to keep the doors bolted. I could see the sheer exhaustion dragging her down, the physical toll of terror taking over her body. When she finally closed her eyes, I quietly backed out of the room, locked the cabin, and got back into my car. The drive to the airport was a blur of cold calculation. I dropped the rental car off at a regional airstrip and boarded a commercial flight back to Chicago. Sitting in that cramped airplane seat, staring out the scratched acrylic window at the clouds below, the reality of what I had to do settled over me. I had to go back to my home. I had to walk through the front doors of the estate my late wife and I had built, and I had to look into the eyes of a monster. I had to look at Derek, my own flesh and blood, knowing he had orchestrated the brutal murder of an innocent woman just to silence his wife. I had to play the role of the broken, grieving 70-year-old father who had lost his grip on reality. I had to let him think he had won, that his flawless deception was holding up, while I systematically dismantled his entire life. The sheer discipline required to not wrap my hands around his throat the moment I saw him felt almost impossible to muster. I landed in Chicago just as the late afternoon sky turned a bruised shade of purple. The city was bitterly cold, the wind cutting through my thin jacket as I stepped out of the terminal and hailed a taxi. I did not call my driver. I did not want Derek to have any advance warning of my arrival. During the long ride to our estate, I practiced my facade. I let my shoulders slump forward, mimicking the heavy, defeated posture I had carried for the past 6 months. I slowed my breathing, dulling the sharp, calculating focus in my eyes, replacing it with the vacant, lost stare of an old man broken by grief. I had to be perfect. If Derek sensed even a fraction of the rage burning inside my chest, he would know something was wrong. He would destroy the financial records, bury the evidence, and disappear before I could bring the authorities down on him. The taxi finally turned onto the long, familiar street leading to my property. The sprawling brick mansion loomed in the distance, a monument to decades of my grueling labor and sacrifice. But as the taxi pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates, I noticed something immediately wrong. The heavy gates were propped wide open. The long circular driveway, usually pristine and empty, was completely packed with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp black uniforms were rushing back and forth, opening doors for men in tailored tuxedos and women in glittering evening gowns. Soft, elegant jazz music drifted through the crisp evening air, echoing across the manicured lawns. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the cold pavement, my confusion rapidly morphing into a deep, sickening disgust. I walked slowly up the winding cobblestone path, keeping my heavy head slightly bowed, playing my part to absolute perfection. The heavy oak front doors were thrown wide open, spilling warm golden light out onto the cold stone steps. Laughter rang out from the grand foyer. It was bright, joyful, carefree laughter echoing down the hall, the kind of sound that had absolutely no place in a house of mourning. I stepped carefully over the threshold, letting my eyes adjust to the brilliant chandelier light. Caterers in pristine white aprons quickly navigated through the crowded hallway, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne flutes and gourmet appetizers. The entire first floor was transformed into a lavish reception hall. Massive floral arrangements covered every available surface, filling the air with the sickeningly sweet scent of fresh roses and expensive perfume. I stood near the entryway, unnoticed by the wealthy guests, mingling and laughing around me. I scanned the crowded room, my heart pounding a slow, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. And then I saw him. Derek stood near the sweeping mahogany staircase, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He looked healthy, vibrant, and completely unburdened by any sense of guilt. He was holding a crystal glass of champagne, surrounded by a group of wealthy investors. He threw his head back and laughed loudly at a joke, the sound cutting through the jazz music like a razor blade. He raised his tall glass high, clinking it against the glass of the woman standing beside him, a woman wearing a stunning, glittering gown. He was celebrating. My daughter-in-law was hiding in a freezing, isolated cabin, terrified for her unborn child, and my son was throwing a spectacular gala in my home. I stood completely still in the shadows of the doorway, watching my son smile, realizing that the boy I had raised was completely dead, and the man standing in front of me was a ruthless stranger I was going to destroy without a single ounce of hesitation. I forced my hands to uncurl from the tight fists they had formed at my sides. Taking a slow and deliberate breath, I stepped out of the shadows of the grand entryway and moved into the brilliant and blinding light of the reception hall. The sheer noise of the party washed over me immediately. It was a sickening blend of clinking crystal glasses, smooth jazz music playing from a live band in the corner, and the loud, confident voices of the corporate elite. Waiters carrying silver trays of expensive caviar and imported truffles glided past me smoothly. Their eyes slid right over my tired and weathered form, as if I were nothing more than a piece of invisible antique furniture. I kept my shoulders slumped heavily. I fixed my gaze on the polished marble floor, projecting the precise image of a shattered old man who had simply wandered into the wrong room. Every single step I took felt like wading through deep and freezing water. My mind kept flashing back to the filthy alleyway in Nevada. I kept seeing the horrific and ropey burn scars covering Maya's thin arms. I could not stop thinking about the sheer and unadulterated terror I had seen in her wide eyes. And yet here in the home my money had built, my son was serving top-tier champagne and laughing with absolute impunity. I navigated through the dense and glittering crowd carefully. I moved closer to the sweeping mahogany staircase where Derek was currently holding court. He was still laughing loudly, his head thrown back in amusement. He painted a picture of perfect health and vibrant youth. As I closed the distance between us, one of the older board members from my logistics firm finally noticed my presence. He touched Derek gently on the arm and gestured in my direction. I watched my son's face transform in a fraction of a second. It was a terrifying and masterful shift in demeanor. The booming laugh vanished instantly from his mouth. The bright and charismatic smile melted into an expression of profound and unbearable sorrow. His shoulders sagged forward dramatically. His brow furrowed in deep distress, and his eyes darkened immediately. He suddenly looked heavy with unshed tears. If I had not just spent the last 24 hours listening to his pregnant wife describe how he intentionally tried to incinerate her, I would have believed his performance completely. It was absolutely flawless. Derek stepped quickly away from his wealthy investors and hurried toward me. His arms were open wide in a welcoming gesture. "Dad," he said softly, his voice thick with perfectly manufactured emotion. "I did not expect you back from Florida so soon. You told me you were staying at the golf resort until Tuesday afternoon." I let him wrap his arms tightly around me. I forced my rigid body to remain completely passive in his embrace. The strong smell of his expensive designer cologne made my stomach turn in disgust. I pulled back from him slowly, keeping my eyes wide and intentionally confused. I was playing the exact part he expected me to play. "Derek, what is all this?" I asked, gesturing weakly at the crowded room and the lavish floral arrangements covering every table. "What is happening in my house today?" He placed a warm and comforting hand on my shoulder. He looked at me with an expression of deep and paternal patience, treating me like a fragile child. "I know it looks overwhelming right now, Dad," he said smoothly, guiding me slightly away from the center of the loud crowd. "But this is not a celebration. This is a very important fundraiser. I have spent the last 3 entire months setting up a charitable foundation. We named it the Maya Caldwell Memorial Charity. We are raising money for the regional burn center tonight in her honor. I wanted to turn our terrible family tragedy into something beautiful. I wanted to build something that would help other families facing unimaginable grief and loss." I stared at his face, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I was trying desperately to mask the violent disgust that was threatening to choke me. He was actually raising money for burn victims in the name of the woman he had intentionally tried to burn alive. The absolute depravity of his lie was staggering and utterly sickening to witness. "That is very thoughtful of you, Derek," I murmured quietly. I let my voice waver just enough to sound frail and deeply moved by his words. "Maya would be very touched by your actions. She would be so proud," Dad, Derek replied, squeezing my shoulder gently to reinforce his lie. "And I could not have done it without professional help. It has been incredibly hard for me, Dad. You know exactly how much I have struggled since the accident. I almost did not make it through these last 6 brutal months. In fact, I am not sure I would be standing here today if someone had not pulled me back from the absolute edge. He turned his body slightly and extended his hand toward a woman standing nearby. The stunning woman who had been standing next to him earlier stepped forward gracefully. The fine silk fabric of her designer gown shimmered brightly under the chandelier light. It was Brooke. She had been Derek's executive assistant for the past 3 years. I remembered her clearly as a sharp and ambitious young woman who always hovered just behind his shoulder, taking meticulous notes and managing his daily schedule. Now she was looking at me with a soft and highly sympathetic smile, holding a delicate flute of champagne in her hand. "You remember, Brooke?" "Dad," Derek said smoothly. He wrapped his arm securely around her slender waist and pulled her close against his side with clear confidence. "She has been my absolute rock through this nightmare. When the grief became too heavy to bear, when I was sitting alone in the dark, contemplating taking my own life to end the pain, Brooke was the one who found me. She pulled me out of the darkness and saved me. She helped me build this charity from the ground up." Brooke smiled sweetly at me, reaching out to gently touch my forearm. "It is so very good to see you, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial and sickly warmth. "We were all so worried about you going down to Florida completely alone. You should be here at home, surrounded by your loving family." As she placed her hand on my arm, the brilliant light from the crystal chandelier caught the heavy jewelry on her left hand. My eyes dropped instantly to her fingers, and a cold shock ripped violently through my nervous system. On her ring finger sat a massive and flawless diamond engagement ring. It was completely surrounded by a sparkling halo of smaller stones. The sheer size of the diamond was aggressive and demanded immediate attention. It was easily a 5-carat stone, a piece of custom jewelry that cost a small fortune to acquire. I looked from the blinding ring back up to my son's handsome face. I let my shock show plainly, though I did not have to fake the reaction at all. "Derek," I stammered weakly. I pointed a trembling finger directly at Brooke's hand and asked, "Are you two together? Is that an engagement ring on her finger?" Derek sighed, making a soft and self-deprecating sound. He looked down at Brooke with an expression of absolute manufactured adoration. "Yes, Dad," he said quietly. "We are officially engaged to be married. I know it seems fast to outsiders. I know people will judge us harshly for moving on only 6 months after losing Maya. But life is so incredibly short, and sudden tragedy teaches us that we cannot wait to find happiness. Maya was the most generous and loving person I have ever known in my life. She would never want me to spend the rest of my days alone in absolute misery. She would want me to move on and find peace. She would want Brooke and me to run this wonderful charity together and save lives in her name." The sheer audacity of his words echoed loudly in my head. He was actively using his dead wife's memory to justify flaunting his new engagement to his former assistant. He was parading her proudly around my home, and she was wearing a massive ring bought with the money he had stolen from my firm. I stood there silently looking at the two of them. They were playing the grieving widower and his beautiful savior perfectly. They were the perfect and tragic couple for the wealthy elites of the city to admire. Brooke stepped even closer to me, her sweet smile widening as she looked deeply into my tired eyes. She let go of Derek's waist and moved forward to embrace me. I stood frozen as she wrapped her arms tightly around my neck. She pressed her soft cheek firmly against mine. The smell of her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming, meant to mask the rot underneath her skin. She held me tightly, playing the part of the loving and supportive future daughter-in-law for anyone who happened to be watching us. But as she pressed her face against my ear, her soft and sympathetic demeanor vanished entirely. Her voice dropped immediately to a barely audible and venomous whisper meant only for me to hear. "We are going to make such a wonderful family." "Richard," she hissed, her breath hot and uncomfortable against my neck. "Just stay out of our way, sign the company transfer papers tomorrow morning, and maybe we will let you die comfortably in a nice nursing home. Otherwise, you might just have a tragic little accident of your own." She pulled back quickly, her face instantly reassembling into a mask of pure and angelic concern. She patted my chest gently, her eyes shining brightly with fake tears. "Take a rest, Richard," she said loudly enough for the nearby guests to clearly hear. "You look so tired tonight. Let us take care of everything from now on." I forced a weak, grateful smile to my face, playing the part of the exhausted old man she was projecting to the room. I patted her cold, manicured hand, resting on my chest, and let out a shaky sigh. "Thank you, Brooke," I murmured, making sure my voice carried a pathetic tremor. "You are very kind to an old man. I think I will go upstairs and rest. The flight took a lot out of me." Derek nodded with profound, manufactured sympathy. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze that felt more like a restraint. "Get some sleep, Dad. We have everything under control here." As I turned to walk toward the grand staircase, the ambient light from the massive crystal chandelier shifted, catching a brilliant flash of deep green against Brooke's collarbone. My breath hitched in my throat, freezing me in place on the polished marble floor. Resting perfectly against her skin, suspended by a delicate platinum chain, was an emerald pendant. It was not just any emerald, it was a teardrop cut surrounded by a distinct asymmetrical halo of crushed diamonds. I felt an icy wave of pure adrenaline wash over my entire body. I knew that necklace intimately. 4 years ago, I had flown privately to Antwerp. I spent 3 weeks working alongside a master jeweler to design that exact pendant as a wedding gift for Maya. It was a completely bespoke piece engineered specifically to highlight a rare flaw in the center stone that gave it a unique starburst reflection. It was one of a kind. There was absolutely no other necklace like it in the world. And yet here it was, draped casually around the neck of the woman who had helped orchestrate Maya's murder. I turned back to face them, letting my eyes drop directly to the jewel. I allowed genuine shock to register on my face, knowing it would easily pass as the sorrowful confusion of a grieving father. "Brooke," I said, pointing a trembling finger at her chest. "That necklace. Where did you get that necklace?" Brooke touched the emerald lightly, a fleeting look of panic crossing her perfectly sculpted features. She glanced quickly at Derek, completely losing her script for a fraction of a second. Derek, however, did not miss a single beat. He stepped smoothly between us, wrapping his arm around Brooke to shield her from my gaze. "Dad, please do not be upset," he said, his voice dropping into a soothing, apologetic register. "I know it looks familiar. After we lost Maya, I was going through her things trying to decide what to do with the jewelry you gave her. I could not bear to look at the original pieces, but I also wanted to keep her memory alive in the new charity. So, I took the original emerald to a jeweler downtown. I had him craft a replica for Brooke to wear as a tribute, a symbol of passing the torch. The original is safely locked away in a bank vault, I promise you." He lied with such breathtaking ease. His eyes were wide, earnest, and completely devoid of guilt. He had taken a murdered woman's custom jewelry, handed it to his mistress, and dared to call it a tribute. I looked at the pendant again. I could see the distinct starburst reflection catching the light. It was no replica. It was the exact piece I had placed around Maya's neck on her wedding day. They had stripped it from her belongings, confident that no one would ever question the grieving widower. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I let my shoulders sag even further, nodding slowly, as if his toxic explanation brought me genuine comfort. "I see," I whispered, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand. "That is a beautiful thought, Derek. Thank you for preserving her memory. I am just very tired. I need to lie down." I turned my back on them and slowly ascended the sweeping mahogany staircase. I gripped the wooden banister tightly, relying on it to keep my legs moving, when every instinct screamed at me to turn around and destroy them both in front of their wealthy guests. I reached the second floor and walked down the long carpeted hallway to the master suite. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, engaging both deadbolts. The moment the locks clicked into place, the frail, broken facade melted away completely. I stood up straight, rolling my stiff shoulders, my mind racing with cold, sharp calculations. The music and laughter from the party downstairs drifted faintly through the thick floorboards, a sickening reminder of the celebration happening in my home. I walked over to the mahogany desk sitting in the corner of the room and booted up my secure tablet. If Derek was brazen enough to give his mistress a stolen custom-made diamond necklace and call it a replica, there was no telling how sloppy he had been with the financial logistics of his fake charity. I opened a secure encrypted browser. I needed to see exactly how he had structured this memorial fund. I bypassed the standard corporate network to avoid triggering any security alerts on Derek's end. I logged directly into the state and federal public filing databases. I typed in the name of the Maya Caldwell Memorial Charity. I expected to find a standard nonprofit registration, perhaps a hastily assembled board of directors filled with Derek's sycophant friends. Instead, the search queries returned absolutely nothing. The charity did not exist in the state of Illinois. It was not registered as a legitimate nonprofit organization anywhere in the United States. My brow furrowed in intense concentration. I expanded my search parameters, pulling up international corporate registries. I cross-referenced Derek's name with recent corporate filings. Finally, a single document materialized on the glowing screen. The charity was not a charity at all. It was a privately held limited liability corporation, and it was registered in a notorious offshore tax haven known for shielding anonymous, untraceable wealth. The registered agent was a dummy corporation, but the primary signatory authority belonged exclusively to Derek and Brooke. They had completely bypassed all philanthropic regulations. This offshore entity was practically a financial black box designed specifically to absorb massive amounts of liquid capital without generating a single tax alert or audit requirement. My son was not raising money for burn victims. He had built a highly sophisticated international washing machine, and he was currently downstairs pouring champagne for the city elite, using a dead woman's name to quietly funnel illicit funds right under the nose of my entire corporate empire. I sat back in the leather desk chair, staring at the glowing screen as the horrible reality solidified in my mind. He was intentionally mocking everything I had built. He was making an absolute and complete fool out of me, parading his deceit in my very own house. I closed the secure browser slowly and deliberately. My hands were perfectly steady now. I was finally ready to step out of the shadows and go to absolute total war against my only son. The bright morning sun felt entirely wrong, too bright and cheerful for the dark reality settling like concrete in my gut. I stood in my massive empty closet, tracing my fingers over the expensive silk ties and tailored suits I had worn for decades of corporate warfare. Today, however, I was dressing for a different kind of battle. My reflection in the full-length mirror showed a weary, broken man with graying hair and dark, heavy bags under his eyes. It was the perfect disguise. Derek would look at this tired shell and see exactly what he wanted to see: a helpless victim ready to be discarded and completely forgotten by the world. After finishing breakfast, I packed my vintage golf clubs and a heavy leather duffel bag. I booked a first-class ticket to Miami, intentionally leaving the printed itinerary directly on the pristine kitchen island where Brooke would undoubtedly find it. When I walked downstairs, Derek was casually sipping a dark espresso and reviewing quarterly financial reports on his tablet. Brooke was arranging fresh white lilies in a crystal vase by the window. I told them I was heading to Florida for a week. I said I needed the ocean air and quiet greens to clear my mind. Derek looked up, flashing that same sickening manufactured concern. He told me to take my time, promising to hold down the corporate fort. Brooke gave me another tight, suffocating hug, wishing me a peaceful journey. I played my pathetic part flawlessly. I forced a sad smile, patted my son's back, and walked out the front doors. My driver took me to the airport. I walked into the terminal, checked my bag, and went straight through security. But I did not board the plane to Miami. Instead, I waited until the flight departed, walked out a side exit, and hailed a discreet black sedan arranged via a prepaid phone. I directed the driver to a brutalist concrete building on the industrial south side. This was far from the financial district where Derek operated. I took a creaking freight elevator down to a damp, windowless basement office. Sitting at a scarred wooden table under harsh fluorescent lights were the only two men I completely trusted. Mitchell Reed was my personal attorney, a man who had guided my empire through corporate warfare for 30 years. Beside him sat Garrett Fox. Garrett was a former intelligence officer turned private investigator, notorious for his ruthless efficiency and complete disregard for boundaries. They were intensely loyal to me, not the company, and certainly not to my son. I sat at the head of the table and placed my tablet flat on the surface. For the next 2 hours, I laid out the devastating reality. I told them about the offshore shell company masquerading as a memorial charity. I explained the stolen jewelry, the staggering sums moving through our accounts, and the chilling conversation I endured the night before. I kept Maya's survival an absolute secret, knowing her safety depended on no one knowing she was breathing. Mitchell lost the color in his face as he realized the terrifying scale of the legal jeopardy Derek had placed my legacy in. Garrett did not flinch. His eyes remained cold, calculating, and predatory. He leaned back in his chair and asked what I wanted to do. I looked at my allies and told them I wanted total destruction. I wanted every asset protected and my son completely isolated, financially paralyzed, and legally exposed. Mitchell opened his briefcase and began drafting emergency injunctions by hand. We had to bypass the normal corporate channels entirely. The general counsel was likely compromised by Derek, meaning any internal move would tip him off. Mitchell explained he could establish airtight blind trusts to quietly absorb and freeze my liquid assets. This maneuver would cut Derek off from the primary family wealth without triggering internal compliance alerts. It was a delicate, high-wire act of financial maneuvering, but Mitchell assured me it could be executed within days. Meanwhile, Garrett took the tablet and began running trace routes on the offshore corporation I had discovered. His fingers moved rapidly over the keyboard. I instructed Garrett to dig ruthlessly into every financial transaction Derek and Brooke had executed. I needed to know where the money originated, what criminal elements they worked for, and how deep the corruption ran. We were going to build an impenetrable cage around my son before he realized the doors were locked. After finalizing the operational details, I left the basement office and took a different car to a modest, anonymous motel. I checked into a cheap room under a different name, paying in cash to avoid a digital footprint. I spent the next 2 agonizing days off the grid, sitting alone in the dark room. I coordinated quietly with Maya at the safe house using the prepaid phone, ensuring she was resting while she carried my grandchild. The waiting was absolute torture. A slow, burning fire, as I anticipated the inevitable clash. I was actively hunting my own flesh and blood, mapping his ultimate downfall with the cold precision I once used to crush corporate rivals. The profound silence of that miserable room pressed heavily against my ears. I paced back and forth across the stained carpet, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. Every single hour felt like a lifetime of endless punishment. I barely slept or ate, surviving only on black coffee and the raw adrenaline coursing through my tired body. My entire existence had been instantly reduced to this singular, terrible mission. I had given my son everything a father could possibly give, and he had chosen to repay that boundless generosity with the most brutal and horrific betrayal imaginable. Then suddenly, and without warning, the cheap plastic phone on the scratched nightstand vibrated violently. It was Garrett calling me on the encrypted line. When I answered, his usually calm, detached, and professional voice was tight, with an unmistakable tension. He did not waste time with standard pleasantries or gentle introductions. He told me he successfully cracked the initial defensive layer of Derek and Brooke's financial firewall. He confirmed the offshore accounts were a massive, tangled mess of illicit cartel money being washed directly through our clean logistics contracts. But that was not the primary reason he was calling so urgently in the middle of the night. Garrett took a sharp breath and told me to sit down immediately. He had bypassed the standard security protocols and illegally accessed the private life insurance registries. What he found buried in the hidden digital archives turned the blood in my veins into freezing ice. Exactly 2 short weeks before the horrific highway crash, Derek had secretly altered Maya's life insurance policy. He bypassed our trusted family broker to avoid suspicious questions, and instead used a shady underground underwriter to aggressively modify the original terms. He had quintupled her coverage in the event of a sudden and accidental death. If Maya died tragically, Derek was legally set to receive a direct, untraceable, and tax-free payout of exactly $10 million. My son had literally priced the violent death of his pregnant wife. The sheer horror of that revelation paralyzed me for a long, suffocating moment. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, staring at the blank wall, as the words Garrett spoke echoed in my ears. Derek had actively monetized the slaughter of his wife. He had looked into the eyes of the woman carrying his unborn child, knowing exactly how much her death would deposit into his accounts. My own flesh and blood was a calculating monster, and I had to burn his world to ashes. But the insurance policy was circumstantial. I needed concrete proof of the active money laundering operation. I needed to catch him cleaning the illicit funds. I told Garrett we needed eyes and ears inside the executive suite at the logistics headquarters. The corporate network was too compromised to rely on internal tracing. Derek and Brooke had locked down the digital perimeter, but they were arrogant. They believed they were untouchable inside the fortress I had built. Garrett laid out a daring infiltration strategy. He would bypass their firewalls by walking right through the front doors. We spent several hours fabricating a flawless digital footprint for a fictitious technology consultant. Using my secure tablet, I drafted a high-priority internal mandate. I bypassed Derek, entirely sending the directive straight to the building security manager. I authorized a mandatory server upgrade for the executive floor for the following morning. When the sun began to rise over the industrial district, I sat at the desk in my motel room, logging into the secure receiver. At precisely 8 in the morning, Garrett walked into the towering glass headquarters of Harrison Logistics. He wore a crisp blue uniform, a tool belt loaded with specialized equipment, and a lanyard displaying his forged clearance. Through the encrypted audio feed buzzing in my earpiece, I listened to the steady sound of his boots crossing the marble lobby. I heard the unsuspecting security guard verify the fabricated work order and grant him unrestricted access to the private executive elevator. My chest tightened with profound anxiety. The executive suite occupied the entire top floor. It was the nerve center of my empire. Garrett stepped off the elevator and was immediately intercepted by the floor receptionist. He delivered his cover story flawlessly. He explained in a bored, technical monotone that he was tasked with hardwiring a new firewall directly into the routing switches inside the executive offices. The receptionist, completely uninterested in the jargon and trusting the clearance, pointed him down the hallway. She casually mentioned that the boss was out at a vendor meeting and the assistant had just stepped out for coffee. I listened intently as the heavy door of the office clicked shut. Garrett moved with frightening speed. Through the feed, I heard the faint rustle of his tools. He was not there to upgrade anything. He planted microscopic high-definition cameras inside the ventilation grates directly above the sprawling desk. He embedded a secondary camera inside the base of an expensive lamp. But the real prize was the digital surveillance. I heard the metallic snap of a keylogger being inserted into the back of the desktop terminal. It was an undetectable device that would capture every keystroke password and offshore account number, transmitting the data to my server. Garrett quickly moved to the adjoining office. This space belonged to Brooke. I heard the heavy breathing of my operative as he navigated the meticulously organized domain. He planted a listening device behind a framed painting and slipped another keylogger into her workstation. He was moving like a ghost, completely silent and highly efficient. I watched the progress bar on my tablet inch forward as the devices synced. The upload was agonizingly slow. We needed 90 seconds. Then my blood ran completely cold. Through the live audio feed, I heard the sharp click of high heels rapidly approaching the thick office door. The receptionist called out cheerfully, welcoming Brooke back to the floor. She was early. She had returned from her coffee run a full 20 minutes before we anticipated. I gripped the edges of my desk. Garrett was still crouched beneath her desk, finalizing the physical connection. If she caught him manipulating her hardware, the entire operation would be exposed. Derek would vanish before the authorities could touch him. I held my breath as the heavy door swung open. The sharp sound of high heels echoed loudly inside the room. For a terrifying suspended second, there was absolute silence. Then the contractor finally spoke. It was calm, polite, and completely unbothered. He spoke from the far side of the room, having silently glided away from her desk in a fraction of a second. "Excuse me, madam," he said, his tone matching the bored contractor persona. "I am just finishing up the localized router diagnostic. I will finish shortly." Brooke let out a sharp, annoyed sigh. She clearly hated the inconvenience of a worker occupying her pristine space. "Just hurry it up," she snapped, her voice dripping with toxic arrogance. "I have an incredibly sensitive international conference call in 5 minutes, and I cannot have any background noise." Garrett apologized meekly, gathered his tool bag, and casually walked out of the office. The heavy door clicked firmly shut behind him. I let out a long exhale, slumping forward in my chair. We had done it. We had successfully bugged the core of the enterprise. 10 minutes later, Garrett sent a text confirming he was safely out of the building. I turned my attention back to the glowing tablet. The hidden microphones and cameras were now fully operational, broadcasting a crystal-clear stream directly to my terminal. The visual feed from the first office flickered to life. I watched her manicured hands fly across her keyboard. At the same time, the feed from the second office initiated. He just returned, slamming his briefcase onto the desk. He looked furious, pacing the room. Then the incoming call indicator on his private line illuminated. He snatched the receiver, pressing it hard against his ear. The hidden microphone captured the conversation with terrifying clarity. It was a harsh, heavily accented voice on the other end of the line. The man did not bother with greetings. He demanded a status update on the current logistical routing. Derek stopped pacing. He leaned heavily over his desk, his voice dropping into a tight whisper. "Listen to me very carefully," Derek hissed into the phone. The physical transport went completely smoothly. The cargo is already secured at the primary distribution hub. But you need to tell your people to be incredibly patient with the financial transfers. We cannot rush this. I am cleaning the next massive batch of liquid cash through the memorial fund tonight. As soon as the charity gala deposits are registered, I will wire the cut directly to the offshore accounts. I sat quietly in the dim light, my heart pounding a furious rhythm. My son was actively conspiring with a dangerous cartel associate, openly discussing the laundering of dirty money through a charity named after the wife he had attempted to murder. The final nail in his coffin had just been securely hammered into place. The terrifying reality of that intercepted phone call echoed in my mind as I sat alone in the stifling darkness of my motel room. My son was actively running illicit cartel funds through a charity named after his supposedly dead wife. But I could not stay in hiding forever. I had to maintain the illusion of the broken, grieving father returning from his solitary golf trip. Early the next morning, I packed my leather duffel bag, checked out of the anonymous motel, and took a private car back to the airport. I waited at the baggage claim until a flight from Miami arrived, seamlessly blending in with the disembarking passengers. When my driver picked me up at the curb, I slumped into the plush leather seat of the town car, closing my eyes and letting my head loll back against the headrest. The physical exhaustion I projected for the driver was not entirely a performance. Over the past week, a strange and creeping lethargy had begun to heavily settle into my bones. It was a profound, suffocating fatigue that seemed to blur the sharp edges of my mind. When the heavy iron gates of my estate slowly parted to let the car inside, I felt a sudden violent wave of dizziness wash over me. The grand brick facade of the mansion seemed to waver and shift in the morning light. I gripped the armrest tightly, forcing myself to take slow, shallow breaths until the nausea passed. This was not the first time my body had betrayed me recently. Ever since I returned from Nevada, I had been experiencing terrifying, and inexplicable memory lapses. There were entire hours missing from my evenings. I would find myself standing in the middle of the grand foyer with absolutely no recollection of how I got there. I would lose my train of thought in the middle of simple conversations with the estate staff. Derek and Brooke had been overly attentive during these confusing episodes. They would exchange deeply sorrowful, patronizing glances, gently guiding me by the elbow back to my bedroom. They constantly suggested that the overwhelming grief of losing Maya was finally breaking my aging mind. I walked through the heavy front doors and was immediately greeted by the suffocating silence of the massive house. Derek had already left for the corporate headquarters, and Brooke was nowhere to be seen. I climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase, my legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. I locked myself inside the master suite and walked straight into the attached bathroom. I gripped the edges of the cold marble sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My skin was pale and drawn, and the whites of my eyes were deeply bloodshot. I splashed freezing water onto my face, trying to clear the thick, suffocating fog that constantly clouded my thoughts. The physical symptoms were escalating at an alarming rate, but it felt entirely chemical, not natural. My mind raced back to the nightly routine established by Brooke ever since she had practically moved into the estate. Every single evening at exactly 9 o'clock, she would gently knock on my study door. She would bring me a steaming cup of chamomile tea, claiming it was a special herbal blend meant to soothe my shattered nerves and help me sleep. I walked out of the bathroom and over to my mahogany desk. Before Garrett had infiltrated the corporate headquarters, I had instructed him to bypass the internal security system of the estate. He had quietly installed microscopic motion-activated cameras in the primary common areas of the house, including the main kitchen. I booted up my encrypted tablet and accessed the secure video server. I needed to see exactly what was happening in my home when I was not looking. I pulled up the archived footage from the kitchen, filtering the search parameters to the previous evening right around 8:45. The high-definition video feed flickered onto the glowing screen. The kitchen was immaculate and empty until the heavy swinging door pushed open and Brooke walked into the frame. She was wearing a plush silk robe, moving with a practiced, comfortable ease, humming a cheerful tune that the sensitive microphones picked up clearly. I watched closely as she retrieved my favorite porcelain mug from the glass cabinet. She placed a tea bag inside and poured boiling water from the kettle. But she did not immediately bring the mug to my study. Instead, she turned around and walked over to the large marble island in the center of the kitchen. She reached deep into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I leaned closer to the tablet screen, my eyes locked on her manicured hands. She unscrewed the child-proof cap and tipped 2 large, chalky white pills into the palm of her hand. She placed the heavy pills inside a small ceramic mortar. Using the matching pestle, she began to grind the pills with a focused, rhythmic intensity. She crushed them until they were nothing more than a fine, powdery dust. The sheer, calculated malice in her movements was absolutely chilling. Once the pills were completely pulverized, she carefully scraped the white powder into my steaming cup of chamomile tea. She picked up a silver spoon and stirred the dark liquid vigorously until the powder was completely dissolved and invisible. She threw the empty amber bottle back into her pocket, quickly rinsed the ceramic mortar in the sink, and wiped down the marble counter to remove any stray traces of the dust. She picked up the porcelain mug, arranged her face into a mask of sweet angelic concern, and walked out of the camera frame, heading straight toward my private study. I sat frozen in the leather chair, staring at the empty digital kitchen. The horrible, suffocating truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. They were poisoning me. My own son and his ruthless mistress were actively poisoning me under my own roof. The terrifying physical symptoms suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The intense dizziness, the sudden nausea, the terrifying memory lapses, and the profound mental fog were not the tragic results of a broken heart or a declining mind. They were the direct chemical results of heavy sedatives and powerful hallucinogens being systematically fed into my bloodstream every single night. The absolute depravity of their plan was staggering. They were not simply waiting for me to die of old age or a broken heart. They were actively manufacturing the stark, undeniable symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. I realized their ultimate, sickening goal. They were intentionally creating a documented physical medical history of severe cognitive decline. They were carefully setting the stage to have me declared legally incompetent by a corrupt medical professional. If I were declared mentally unfit to manage my affairs, my son would immediately invoke the medical power of attorney clauses buried deep in our family trust documents. He would legally seize control of my remaining voting shares. The trap was fully set, but I would not drink it. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the soft knock sounded at my heavy oak door. I minimized the security footage on my tablet and took a steadying breath. I forced my posture to slump, letting my shoulders drop and my hands tremble. I shuffled across the Persian rug, dragging my feet to simulate the heavy gait of a man losing control of his body. When I opened the door, Brooke stood there with that practiced, angelic smile plastered across her face. She held the steaming porcelain mug in both hands, offering it like a comforting gift. I reached out with shaky fingers, projecting the frail vulnerability she expected. I thanked her in a hoarse voice, telling her how much I appreciated her taking time to care for an old man. Her smile widened immediately, her eyes gleaming with sick satisfaction as she wished me a peaceful night. I closed the door, turning the deadbolt with a loud click. I walked straight to the large ficus plant in the corner of my study. Without hesitation, I poured the poisoned chamomile tea directly into the dark soil. I left a tiny swallow of liquid at the bottom to make it look entirely convincing for the morning. I was not going to call the police. That would give Derek a chance to deploy his corporate lawyers to muddy the waters. Calling the authorities now would only alert him to my awareness, allowing him to destroy the offshore routing data. No, I was going to use their own malicious weapon directly against them. The next morning, I began delivering the performance of a lifetime. When I shuffled into the grand dining room for breakfast, I wore a mismatched suit jacket and trousers. I left my tie undone, letting the silk fabric hang loosely around my neck. Derek and Brooke sat at the long mahogany table discussing their offshore logistics quietly over dark coffee. The moment I entered, their conversation stopped. I walked over to the silver coffee carafe and bumped my hip hard against the marble counter, knocking a spoon to the floor and letting out a sharp gasp of manufactured confusion. Derek looked up instantly, his eyes narrowing like a predator watching a wounded animal stumble into a trap. I turned to Brooke, squinting tightly, as if I were desperately struggling to pierce through a thick mental fog. I looked directly at her and called her by my late wife's name, asking why she had changed the floral arrangements. The absolute thrill that flashed across Derek's face was sickening to witness. Brooke played along beautifully, utilizing a slow, patronizing tone to correct me. She placed her hand over mine, reminding me of her actual name with a sickly sweet condescension. I mumbled a pathetic apology, rubbing my temples, and sat down heavily in my chair, staring vacantly at my empty plate. Over the next 4 days, I escalated my manufactured decline with calculated precision. I stopped showering regularly, letting a rough stubble grow over my cheeks to complete the physical transformation into a man entirely incapable of caring for himself. I intentionally misplaced my expensive watches, leaving them inside the refrigerator. I began wandering the long hallways of the estate during the early hours of the morning, pretending to look for Maya, calling out her name into the empty house. Every single night, Brooke delivered the poisoned tea with a sickeningly sweet smile, and every single night, the ficus plant absorbed the heavy sedatives meant to permanently destroy my brain. By Thursday afternoon, Derek was absolutely brimming with dangerous overconfidence. He walked into my private study holding a thick stack of corporate authorization forms, claiming they were standard operational renewals that required my formal signature. I took his expensive gold fountain pen with a wildly shaking hand, my breathing shallow and erratic. Instead of signing on the designated line at the bottom of the page, I scrawled my name diagonally across the center of the text, pressing down so hard the sharp nib nearly tore through the thick parchment paper. I looked up at him with wide, watery eyes, my jaw trembling slightly, asking if I had done a good job. Derek snatched the ruined papers away, sighing loudly in exaggerated frustration, but I clearly saw the triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He genuinely thought I was gone. He thought his chemical warfare had successfully hollowed out my mind, leaving him free to manipulate my empire without any resistance. Because they firmly believed I was incapacitated, their operational discipline began to unravel. They grew incredibly sloppy in their private conversations, utterly unaware that my hidden microphones were actively recording every word they spoke inside the estate. They openly discussed the staggering sums of cartel cash flowing through the fake memorial charity, laughing cruelly about how easy it had been to fool the old man into surrendering his legacy. They joked about the dosage of the pills, wondering if they should increase the hallucinogens to speed up the final legal process. I sat in my locked bathroom every night documenting every confession, every financial figure, and every malicious joke, building a massive mountain of undeniable criminal evidence. I decided to push them even further into their arrogant complacency. That evening, as Derek and Brooke walked together through the grand foyer, laughing about an upcoming offshore wire transfer, I deliberately staged a minor fall on the bottom 3 steps of the sweeping staircase. I let my legs buckle out from under me, sliding down the carpeted stairs with a loud thud that shook the banister. I lay flat on the cold marble floor, whimpering softly and clutching my knee in mock agony. Derek did not rush over to help his father up. He stood absolutely still near the entryway, looking down at my pathetic form with a chilling, detached calculation. He was evaluating exactly how much longer he had to tolerate my miserable existence. Brooke finally stepped forward, rushing to my side and helping me to my feet with fake, cloying sympathy that made my skin crawl. She practically carried my weight as she guided me back upstairs to my bedroom, constantly reassuring me that everything was going to be all right. She tucked me tightly under the heavy comforter and turned out the bright overhead lights. I kept my eyes tightly shut, intentionally slowing my breathing to a deep rhythmic pattern, perfectly simulating a heavy drug-induced sleep. I let my jaw drop slightly, maintaining the absolute illusion of total vulnerability. Derek walked slowly into the dark room a few moments later. He stood directly over my bed, completely silent, watching my chest rise and fall in the shadows. He let out a dark, deeply satisfied chuckle that echoed menacingly off the bedroom walls. He turned to Brooke, his voice loud, confident, and completely unguarded in the quiet room, utterly convinced I could not comprehend a single word. "It is completely done," he boasted proudly, the sheer arrogance dripping from every single syllable. "The old fool is completely out of his mind, practically a vegetable. I just got off the phone with the medical proxy. The official board meeting is set for Friday." The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the suffocating darkness of my master suite. I lay perfectly still under the thick comforter, staring blindly at the ceiling, while Derek's arrogant words echoed continuously in my mind. Friday. I had exactly 3 days before my own son intended to legally erase me from existence. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me again, but the initial shock was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I spent the quiet, agonizing hours mentally cataloging every piece of evidence I had gathered, preparing for the inevitable strike. When the first pale rays of morning light began to filter through the heavy velvet curtains, I quietly retrieved my encrypted tablet from its hiding place beneath the false floorboard in my closet. I plugged in the earpiece and initiated a secure video call with Mitchell and Garrett. The connection established immediately. Garrett looked deeply exhausted, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of multiple computer monitors in his dark basement office. Mitchell sat beside him, nervously adjusting his glasses. They did not waste any time with pleasantries. Garrett told me he had finally managed to shatter the encrypted firewall guarding Derek's offshore shell corporation. What Garrett revealed next made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. The $10 million life insurance payout from Maya's supposed death had not simply been absorbed into the fake memorial charity. It had barely rested in the offshore account for 24 hours before it was instantly wired through a complex maze of international banks. Garrett had successfully traced the final destination of those funds. The money had gone directly into the pockets of an incredibly dangerous underground gambling syndicate operating out of Macau. Derek had accumulated a massive, insurmountable mountain of illicit gambling debts, and he had literally sacrificed his pregnant wife to pay off his ruthless creditors. But the horrifying truth did not end there. Mitchell pulled up a series of highly classified financial documents on his screen, his face pale with absolute terror. The $10 million had only covered a fraction of Derek's outstanding liabilities. To keep the syndicate from collecting his head, Derek secretly leveraged the primary physical assets of Harrison Logistics as direct collateral. He pledged our entire fleet of transport vehicles, regional distribution centers, and massive commercial real estate holdings to the mob. Because Derek only held operational control and not the majority voting shares, the syndicate could not legally liquidate those assets yet. Mitchell explained the deadline. The cartel gave Derek until Friday to secure full unrestricted ownership of my empire. If he failed to deliver my voting shares, the syndicate would systematically dismantle my life's work, liquidate everything, and execute my son as a penalty for his extreme arrogance. The scale of the nightmare was almost too much to process. He was a desperate animal, trapped by his own massive failures. He was trying to hand over the empire I built to criminals just to save his own pathetic skin. I instructed Garrett to compile every digital record wire transfer and forged loan document into a secure file. I told Mitchell to prepare the blind trusts to isolate my personal wealth the absolute second I gave the command. I terminated the encrypted connection, hid the tablet, and slowly dressed for the morning. I had to maintain the fragile illusion of the broken, senile old man. I ruffled my unwashed hair, put on a wrinkled cardigan over a mismatched shirt, and began my slow, shuffling walk down the grand mahogany staircase. The house was already filled with the sickening scent of expensive coffee and fresh pastries. Derek and Brooke were sitting together in the sunlit breakfast nook. They were speaking in hushed, urgent whispers, their heads bent closely together over a sleek silver laptop. The moment my slippers scraped loudly against the pristine kitchen tiles, they slammed the laptop shut in unison. Brooke immediately plastered that same fake angelic smile onto her perfectly contoured face. She jumped up from her leather stool and rushed over to me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders and guiding me to a chair as if I were made of fragile spun glass. Derek watched me sit down with intense clinical evaluation. I intentionally let my hands tremble as I reached for a heavy ceramic coffee mug, purposely knocking it against the edge of the granite counter so the dark liquid spilled over the sides. I stared blankly down at the rapidly growing puddle, letting my mouth hang slightly open in manufactured confusion. Derek sighed heavily, a sound of profound and tragic burden. He walked around the island and placed a firm restraining hand on my trembling shoulder. He looked down at me with aggressive, suffocating sympathy. "Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a slow, patronizing rhythm, as if he were speaking to a toddler. "Brooke and I have been talking, and we are incredibly worried about you. Your memory lapses are getting significantly worse, and you seem so confused all the time. We cannot just sit by and watch you decline like this. I have gone ahead and scheduled a very important routine doctor appointment for you this morning. I want to make sure you are getting the proper medical care you need." I kept my eyes fixed blankly on the spilled coffee, but my mind was working with lightning speed. The final phase of their trap was actively springing shut. This was not a routine medical checkup. This was the exact appointment Derek had loudly bragged about the previous night. He was taking me to a bribed, corrupt psychiatrist prepared to officially diagnose me with severe, irreversible Alzheimer's disease. They needed a legally binding medical declaration of my incompetence to trigger the medical power of attorney clauses before the cartel deadline. They were going to chemically sedate me, drag me into a clinic, and have a licensed professional strip away my human rights with the stroke of a pen. I slowly raised my head and looked at my son. I let my eyes water, projecting the terror of an old man losing his mind. "I do not want to go to a doctor, Derek," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I am just a little tired. I just need to rest. Please do not make me leave the house today." Brooke knelt down beside my chair, stroking my arm with her cold, manicured fingers. "It will be completely painless, Richard," she cooed softly, her dark eyes shining with malicious delight. "We are only trying to help you. Derek and I will be right there with you the entire time. You have absolutely nothing to worry about." Derek gripped my frail shoulder even tighter, his rigid fingers digging deeply into my aching collarbone. "It is not a request, Dad," he stated firmly, dropping the gentle facade for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold panic simmering directly beneath his pale skin. "You are going to this appointment, and we are going to get your affairs in perfect order today. It is for your own good." I nodded slowly, playing the victim ready to spring my trap. I sat in the back seat of Derek's massive luxury SUV, the leather interior feeling like a padded coffin. Derek was driving while Brooke sat in the passenger seat, periodically turning around to flash me that venomous, reassuring smile. They were taking me to the slaughter. I knew exactly what awaited me at that private clinic. A corrupt physician was standing by, ready to strip away my autonomy. I needed a way out, and I needed it immediately. As we merged onto the busy interstate, I initiated my desperate countermeasure. I began to gasp for air, clutching my chest with both hands. I let out a sharp, ragged wheeze, forcing my body to tremble violently. Derek glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing in irritation, before genuine panic set in. I slumped sideways against the window, emitting a pained groan. Brooke spun around, her voice incredibly shrill and loud. She screamed at Derek to pull over, terrified that their golden goose was about to expire before signing the trust over to their control. They needed me legally incapacitated, but they desperately needed me alive to execute the transfer. Derek swerved violently across 3 lanes of traffic, slamming on the brakes along the narrow shoulder. I kept my breathing shallow, muttering weakly about a crushing weight on my chest. Derek was visibly sweating, cursing loudly, as he realized he could not walk a dying man into a psychiatric evaluation without raising massive alarms. He angrily slammed his fist against the dashboard, canceled the appointment over the car's Bluetooth system, and immediately redirected the vehicle toward the nearest emergency room. By the time we arrived at the hospital, my manufactured symptoms fully stabilized, but the psychiatric evaluation was completely and successfully aborted. I had bought myself a crucial window of time. Later that evening, after enduring hours of pointless medical observation and playing the confused, exhausted patriarch to absolute perfection, I was finally left alone in my master suite. Derek and Brooke were downstairs, furiously attempting to manage the cartel's mounting impatience. I locked my heavy door, activated the white noise generator to scramble any potential listening devices they might have planted, and opened my encrypted tablet. Garrett was already waiting in the secure digital room. His face was a mask of grim, absolute severity. I had known Garrett for over a decade, and I had never seen him look genuinely disturbed until this exact moment. He did not offer any pleasantries or gentle introductions. He simply stated that he had intercepted a highly encrypted phone call between Brooke and an untraceable burner phone. Garrett explained that he had successfully identified the man on the other end of the line. It was the mechanic. It was the exact man Derek and Brooke had hired to sever the brake lines on Maya's vehicle 6 months ago. Garrett warned me to brace myself. He said the sheer brutality of what he was about to play would change everything I thought I knew about the depths of human depravity. I pressed the device against my ear, my heart pounding a heavy, sickening rhythm against my ribs, and signaled Garrett to play the intercepted audio file. The recording crackled with digital static before Brooke's sharp, impatient voice pierced through the silence. She was demanding to know why the mechanic was asking for another wire transfer when his exorbitant fee had already been paid in full. The man's voice was low, rough, and laced with a terrifying casualness. He laughed dryly, telling Brooke that the price of complete silence had just gone up. He reminded her of the exact logistical nightmare they had asked him to pull off. It was not just cutting a brake line, he argued. That was the easy part. The extremely difficult part was providing the biological collateral. My blood ran completely cold as I listened to Brooke sigh in deep, callous annoyance. She reminded him that she had done all the heavy lifting. I sat frozen in my leather chair as Brooke systematically outlined the darkest, most gruesome truth of my entire existence. She coldly recounted how she had spent weeks scouting the impoverished industrial districts of Chicago. She had actively hunted for a vulnerable transient woman whose physical build closely matched Maya's height and weight. Brooke bragged about how she lured the innocent homeless woman into her vehicle with the promise of a warm meal and a lucrative temporary job. She detailed how she had heavily sedated the terrified woman, stripped her of her ragged clothes, and dressed her in one of Maya's expensive designer sweaters. They had deliberately placed an unconscious, completely innocent human being into the driver's seat of Maya's car just moments before the mechanic initiated the catastrophic mechanical failure. They had burned an innocent woman alive simply to provide the dental records and charred remains necessary to close the police investigation and claim the massive insurance payout. Brooke ended the horrific phone call by threatening to have the cartel silence the mechanic permanently if he ever asked for another dime. The audio file ended abruptly, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in my study. I could not breathe. I was absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated evil residing under my own roof. My son and his future bride were not just corporate thieves and offshore money launderers. They were cold-blooded, calculating serial killers who assigned zero value to human life. I immediately initiated a secure connection to the prepaid cellular phone I had left with Maya at the isolated cabin. When she finally answered, her voice was soft and heavily laced with deep exhaustion. I knew I could not shield her from this terrible truth. She needed to know the absolute scale of the monsters we were fighting against. With a violently trembling voice, I relayed the entire contents of the intercepted wiretap. I told her about the innocent woman Brooke had maliciously hunted down in the cold streets. I told her about the heavy sedatives, the stolen clothing, and the horrific reality of whose body was actually buried in the opulent family plot under her name. A ragged soul-tearing sob erupted violently through the speaker. I listened helplessly as Maya collapsed onto the wooden floor of the safe house, weeping with a profound, earth-shattering agony. She wept for the nameless, forgotten woman who had suffered a terrifying and fiery death in her place. The immense weight of survivor's guilt crashed down upon her, her heartbroken cries echoing through the encrypted line. I gripped the heavy edges of my mahogany desk until my fingers went completely numb. The overwhelming sadness in my chest instantly hardened into something remarkably sharp, cold, and utterly merciless. I told Maya to breathe. I told her to hold our unborn child tightly and to stay hidden safely in the shadows. I made her a solemn, unbreakable promise. I swore on the sacred grave of my late wife that the time for hiding and playing the victim was officially over. I told her I was going to systematically rip Derek and Brooke's entire criminal empire down to the absolute bedrock. I promised her that absolute hell was coming to Chicago. I ended the call with Maya and carefully placed the prepaid cellular phone back into its concealed compartment beneath my heavy oak floorboards. The profound, suffocating darkness of my bedroom felt entirely different now. It was no longer a miserable cage built by my traitorous son. It was the staging ground for his total annihilation. I glanced at the glowing red numbers on my digital alarm clock. It was exactly 10 in the evening on Thursday. In less than 12 hours, Derek intended to march me into a sham medical evaluation, declare me legally incompetent, and hand my entire life of work over to a ruthless underground syndicate. He firmly believed he held all the winning cards, completely unaware that I was actively building a guillotine for his execution. I opened my encrypted tablet and immediately initiated a secure video conference. Garrett and Mitchell appeared on the screen almost instantly, their faces pale and exhausted in the harsh light of their respective offices. But they were not alone this time. A third square flickered onto the screen, revealing a stern, highly observant woman fighting in a sterile, brightly lit room. Mitchell quickly introduced her as Special Agent Harris, a senior operative within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in organized financial crime and major syndicate dismantling. Garrett had spent the last 2 hours securely transmitting our massive mountain of accumulated evidence directly to her encrypted servers. She had reviewed the audio wiretaps regarding the murdered homeless woman, the offshore routing numbers tied to the Macanese gambling syndicate, and the digital logs of Brooke crushing severe hallucinogens into my evening tea. Agent Harris did not waste time with formal pleasantries. She spoke with a cold, terrifying efficiency that I deeply appreciated. She informed me that federal tactical teams were already being quietly mobilized across the city. Warrants were actively being drafted by a federal judge under absolute secrecy. However, she needed me to execute my financial maneuvers flawlessly tonight. If Derek noticed the corporate assets moving before the trap snapped shut, he might panic and flee the country, or worse, the cartel might preemptively strike him, taking my company down in the violent crossfire. I needed to isolate the wealth and sever his access entirely, creating an impenetrable legal wall before the sun came up. The sheer tension of the task was suffocating. I had a narrow window of exactly 3 hours to completely restructure an empire I had spent decades building. I sat at my desk, my fingers hovering over the glowing keyboard of the secure tablet. Mitchell walked me through the complex, delicate act of digital financial maneuvering. We had to establish a series of irrevocable blind trusts, transferring the massive physical assets, the global logistics fleet, the regional distribution centers, and all liquid capital out of the primary corporate holding accounts. The terrifying complication was the internal compliance software. Derek had weaponized the corporate automated security protocols. If a transfer exceeding $1 million hit the mainframe without his secondary authorization code, warning alarms would immediately ping his personal cellular phone down the hall. I would be exposed instantly. Garrett took over the audio feed, his fingers flying across his own keyboard in his basement war room. He explained that he was going to launch a highly sophisticated localized denial of service attack, specifically targeting the personal devices owned by Derek and the executive security servers. It would not shut the system down completely, which would arouse immediate suspicion, but it would forcefully delay the automated alert notifications by artificially flooding the network with ghost traffic. He warned me that I had to move with absolute unforgiving speed. Once he initiated the digital suppression, the clock would start ticking. If I hesitated or if the legal routing codes contained a single typographical error, the delayed alerts would break through the suppression and Derek would know I was emptying the vaults. I took a deep, steadying breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second to center my racing mind, and gave Garrett the verbal command to begin. The operation commenced with a terrifying silence. Mitchell began feeding me the complex routing numbers and legally binding authorization codes. I typed frantically, my eyes darting between the transfer screens and the progress bar Garrett was broadcasting to my tablet. I was actively draining the very accounts Derek had desperately leveraged as collateral to the mob. First, I moved the liquid cash, nearly $80 million, sweeping it into a secure, federally protected trust account that only Mitchell and I could legally access. My hands cramped from the sheer speed of the data entry, but I could not afford to stop. Next came the physical assets. I authorized the immediate transfer of all holding deeds for our commercial real estate portfolio, pulling them out from under the corporate umbrella and locking them safely away. Every single keystroke felt like diffusing a live explosive. The digital clock on my screen mercilessly ticked past midnight. We were 90 minutes into the operation, and the voice Garrett projected cracked through the earpiece tight with mounting stress. He warned us that the internal security algorithm was beginning to adapt to his ghost traffic. The server was attempting to force the delayed notifications through the bottleneck. He told me I had roughly 10 minutes left before the cellular phone Derek owned would begin ringing uncontrollably. I pushed through the burning exhaustion in my eyes and moved to the final, most crucial step of the night. I was rewriting my last will and testament. I legally stripped Derek of any and all future claims to my estate, my company, and my personal wealth. I transferred everything into a secure, untouchable trust exclusively managed by Maya for the benefit of my unborn grandchild. I digitally signed the sprawling document legally cementing absolute financial ruin for him and hit the final execution command. Garrett immediately terminated his network suppression, allowing the empty, harmless routine traffic to resume its normal flow. The massive wealth of Harrison Logistics was now completely safe, hidden behind a fortress of impenetrable federal and legal protections. Derek was currently sleeping just down the grand hallway, utterly oblivious to the fact that he no longer controlled a single dime. He was effectively a dead man, walking desperately, holding onto a hollowed-out corporate shell that could no longer protect him from the violent creditors he had so foolishly courted. Agent Harris confirmed receipt of the final legally binding documents. She promised me that her tactical teams would be waiting in the shadows tomorrow morning, ready to strike the moment the board meeting convened. I thanked my allies, severed the secure connection, and carefully powered down the tablet. I quickly changed into my old stained pajamas. I climbed into bed, pulling the comforter to my chin, resuming my pathetic character. The heavy door of my suite creaked open. Derek stepped quietly into the dark room. He walked to my bed, looking down with a chilling, predatory satisfaction. He held a thick leather folder. He dropped it onto my wooden nightstand. He leaned down close. "Just sign these tomorrow, Dad," he whispered softly. "You can finally rest." The heavy leather folder sat on the wooden nightstand like a dormant explosive. I stared at it as the pale light of Friday morning crept through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains. Derek had left it there as a sinister promise, a tangible manifestation of his ultimate betrayal. I pushed the comforter aside, letting my bare feet rest against the cold hardwood floor. My body felt incredibly light, entirely purged of the synthetic lethargy that had clouded my mind for the past week. Pouring the poisoned chamomile tea into the ficus plant had fully restored my sharp, calculating focus. However, I knew I had to maintain the physical illusion of a severely broken, mentally compromised old man. Today was the day my son intended to slaughter me in the corporate arena, and I had to walk into the amphitheater looking exactly like a helpless victim. I walked into my expansive closet and deliberately selected a charcoal gray suit that was tailored just slightly too large for my frame. The excess fabric bunched around my shoulders and hung loosely at my wrists, perfectly, creating the visual effect of an elderly man rapidly wasting away. I left my silver hair uncombed and allowed my shoulders to slump forward physically, carrying the manufactured weight of severe cognitive decline. I shuffled out of the master suite, my breathing shallow and erratic, and began the slow, agonizing descent down the grand mahogany staircase. The atmosphere inside the estate was remarkably different this morning. The suffocating manufactured warmth of the past few days had completely vanished, replaced by an icy, tense silence. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Derek and Brooke were waiting for me in the grand foyer. The time for playing the concerned, loving caretakers had officially expired. The heavy gilded masks they had worn for months were completely discarded. Derek stood with his arms firmly crossed over his chest, his posture rigid and domineering. Brooke leaned against the marble console table, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, predatory gleam. They did not offer me a seat, and they did not ask how I had slept. They simply stared at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. Derek took a slow, deliberate step forward, pulling a thick stack of printed financial ledgers from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He thrust the papers directly against my chest, forcing me to take them with violently trembling hands. "I want you to look at those very carefully," Derek stated, his voice dropping into a harsh, menacing whisper that echoed sharply in the silent foyer. He did not call me Dad. The filial bond was entirely severed. Those are the finalized internal audit reports for the logistics division over the past 6 months. You will notice that a massive amount of highly irregular, untraceable cash has been systematically funneled through our accounts. Brooke pushed herself off the marble table and glided over to stand directly beside him, her presence amplifying the threat. She pointed a sharp, manicured fingernail at the bottom of the top page. "Do you see the authorization signatures, Richard?" she asked, her tone dripping with toxic venom. "Every single one of those fraudulent offshore transfers was directly authorized by your digital signature." I stared down at the documents, letting my hands shake so violently that the papers rattled against each other. I looked up at my son, projecting absolute, helpless confusion. "I do not understand, Derek," I stammered, letting my voice waver pitifully. "I never signed these documents. I do not know anything about these offshore accounts. What is happening with my company, Derek?" Let out a sharp, cruel laugh that chilled me to the bone. "It does not matter what you actually know or do not know," he sneered, his face inches from mine. "What matters is what the federal authorities will believe when we hand them this entire file. They will look at your documented, rapidly declining mental state. They will see the severe dementia we have on record. And they will conclude that a senile, confused old man completely destroyed his own empire by laundering money for an underground cartel." Brooke leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a sinister, commanding hiss. "We are giving you a very simple choice this morning, Richard. We can drive to the corporate headquarters, walk into the board of directors meeting, and you can quietly, peacefully sign over your remaining voting shares to Derek. You can step down gracefully due to your unfortunate medical condition. If you do that, we will ensure you are comfortable in a very quiet, very secure, private facility for the rest of your declining years." She paused, letting the heavy threat hang in the cold morning air. "But if you try to fight us in that room, if you utter a single word of resistance or defiance, we will immediately leak these exact documents to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the financial press. If you fight me today, I will personally guarantee that you spend your final years locked inside a federal prison cell, completely disgraced and absolutely penniless." Derek threatened, his eyes completely devoid of any remaining humanity. "You will lose your legacy, your freedom, and your mind behind bars. Do not test me. I have everything I need to bury you forever." The sheer depravity of his ultimatum was staggering. He was openly threatening to frame his own father for a massive federal crime to cover his own colossal, lethal mistakes. He was absolutely desperate to secure the voting shares before his violent cartel creditors dismantled the company and ended his life. I looked between my ruthless, cornered son and the cold, calculating woman standing beside him. I knew I had to deliver the final, flawless performance to ensure they walked blindly into the federal trap waiting for them. I let my shoulders collapse entirely, bowing my head in utter defeat. I allowed a single manufactured tear to trace a slow path down my wrinkled cheek. I let out a long, ragged exhale, a sound of profound surrender. I slowly raised my head, looking at Derek with wide, terrified eyes. "You win, Derek," I whispered, my voice completely broken and hollow. "I will not fight you anymore. Just please do not let them lock me away in a prison. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just let me have some peace." Derek smirked, a wide, triumphant grin stretching across his arrogant face. He truly believed he had completely broken me. He snatched the fake ledgers out of my trembling hands and sharply gestured toward the heavy oak front doors. He commanded me to get into the waiting car, telling me it was time to finalize the transition of power. The drive into the city was silent. I sat in the plush back seat, staring blankly out the tinted window. Derek sat beside me, aggressively scrolling through his phone, entirely focused on his impending victory. The town car slowly pulled up to the sweeping entrance of Harrison Logistics. Derek gripped my arm. I walked into the gleaming glass boardroom, perfectly looking the part of a helpless lamb walking directly to the slaughter. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom glided shut behind me, sealing us inside. The room was already packed. The entire board of directors, the senior executive team, and our largest shareholders were seated around the massive mahogany table. As Derek guided me by the elbow toward a leather chair at the far end of the room, conversations instantly ceased. A heavy silence descended over the gathered professionals. I kept my head bowed, my eyes fixed firmly on the carpet, shuffling my feet with agonizing slowness. I could feel the collective weight of their pity pressing down upon my shoulders. These were men and women I had known for decades, people I had personally mentored and led through countless corporate battles. Now they were looking at me as if I were a ghost, a tragic relic of a bygone era. Brooke took a seat near the front, adjusting her tailored designer skirt and crossing her legs with a sickening elegance. She looked around the room with the quiet, supreme confidence of a queen surveying her newly conquered court. Derek practically pushed me down into the chair, giving my shoulder one last excessively firm squeeze before marching toward the front podium. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. He looked out over the sea of dark suits, his face arranged into a flawless mask of profound sorrow. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Derek began, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. He paused, looking down at his hands, playing the part of a son carrying an unbearable burden. "As you all know, the past 6 months have been incredibly difficult for our family. The tragic sudden loss of my beautiful wife, Maya, has left a void that can never truly be filled. But the tragedy did not end there. The grief has taken a terrible, devastating toll on my father." Derek gestured sadly toward my slumped figure at the end of the table. A collective murmur of sympathetic sighs rippled through the boardroom. I kept my chin resting near my chest, my hands resting limply on my lap, continuing my pathetic performance. Derek took a deep breath, projecting the image of a dutiful, heartbroken heir. "I have tried everything to help him recover." Derek continued, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "But his medical team has confirmed what we have all been witnessing over these past few weeks. My father is suffering from a rapid, severe, and irreversible cognitive decline. He is experiencing profound memory lapses, dangerous confusion, and an absolute inability to manage the complex daily operations of this enterprise." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Several of them cast worried glances in my direction. I forced a slight tremble into my hands, ensuring everyone saw exactly what Derek wanted them to see. "It breaks my heart to stand before you today," Derek proclaimed, his tone rising with passionate, sickening sincerity. "But the survival of Harrison Logistics must always come first. This company is a living, breathing entity that supports thousands of families around the globe. We cannot allow sentimentality to endanger our future. Therefore, for the good of the company and for the personal safety and well-being of my father, I am officially enacting the medical power of attorney clauses embedded in our founding charter. As of this morning, I will be assuming full uncontested control of all voting shares, asset management, and executive direction." The sheer audacity of his speech was absolutely breathtaking. He was standing in front of my most trusted colleagues, using my manufactured illness to justify a hostile criminal takeover. He was wrapping his lethal cartel-driven desperation in the warm, comforting flag of corporate duty and filial responsibility. Brooke nodded solemnly from her seat, dabbing at the corner of her dry eye with a white tissue. Derek stepped away from the wooden podium, holding a thick leather folio containing the final legally binding transfer documents. He walked down the long length of the mahogany table, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. He stopped directly in front of my chair. He opened the heavy folder, smoothing the crisp white pages flat against the table. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his breast pocket and gently placed it down right next to the signature line. The entire room watched in absolute breathless silence. I stared down at the documents, letting my breathing turn ragged and shallow. I slowly reached out my fingers, trembling violently as they hovered over the silver pen. I picked it up, my grip weak and clumsy, the metal casing slipping slightly against my skin. I hovered the sharp tip of the pen just millimeters above the thick paper. Derek leaned in close, his face dropping out of the view of the board members. "Just sign the line, Dad," he hissed under his breath, his voice laced with venomous urgency. "Do it right now or I will end you." I held the pen there for one last agonizing second, letting the absolute certainty of his victory wash over him. I wanted him to feel the crown resting firmly upon his head before I severed his neck. Then I simply opened my hand. The heavy silver pen dropped from my fingers, hitting the polished mahogany table with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom. I did not reach down to pick it up. Instead, I planted my hands firmly on the armrests of my leather chair. I stopped the manufactured trembling in my arms instantly. I rolled my shoulders back, taking a deep, steady, and incredibly powerful breath. I slowly pushed myself up, rising from the chair until I was standing perfectly straight. The hunched, frail posture I had maintained for days completely evaporated. I drew myself up to my full height, towering over my son, with the absolute dominating physical presence of the corporate titan I had always been. A startled gasp echoed from the far side of the room. Brooke dropped her white tissue, her jaw falling open in complete shock. Derek stumbled backward, taking a clumsy, panicked step away from the table. The smug, victorious smirk on his face instantly shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at me as if a corpse had crawled out of a casket. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a breathless wheeze escaped his lips. I stared down at him, my eyes completely cold, calculated and utterly devoid of any remaining paternal affection. I was no longer a grieving father. I was the executioner. "My mind is perfectly fine, Derek." I stated, my voice completely clear, deep and resonating with absolute, terrifying authority. The sound of my true voice, strong and unwavering, sent a visible shudder down his spine. I locked my eyes directly onto his terrified gaze, refusing to let him look away from the total destruction he had brought upon himself. "But your offshore accounts," I continued, my words cutting through the deadly silence of the room like jagged glass, "are not." The sheer weight of my declaration hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom. Derek stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his desperate brain failed to process the sudden catastrophic shift in reality. The prominent board members, who only seconds ago had looked at me with deep pity, were now staring in absolute bewilderment. I did not give my son the opportunity to recover his balance. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket and calmly extracted a small, sleek black remote control. I held it up for the entire room to see, locking my gaze onto Brooke, who had suddenly turned the color of freshly fallen snow. With a deliberate, forceful press of my thumb, I triggered the secondary presentation system. The massive digital screens lining the mahogany walls instantly flickered to life. The dark monitors were immediately flooded with high-definition financial ledgers, stark offshore routing numbers, and a relentless cascade of illicit wire transfers. The intricate, damning web of Derek's hidden shell companies was laid bare for the absolute elite of Harrison Logistics to witness. Gasps of horror erupted from the senior executive team as the staggering multi-million-dollar figures scrolled continuously across the bright screens. The chief financial officer leaped from his leather chair, pushing his silver spectacles up the bridge of his nose, his eyes darting frantically over the undeniable evidence of massive corporate money laundering. I watched Derek physically shrink, retreating until his back hit the cold glass wall of the boardroom. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and the presentation had only just begun. I pressed the button a second time. The financial data vanished, replaced immediately by the crisp, high-definition surveillance footage Garrett had pulled from my estate kitchen. The hidden camera angle provided a perfect, undisputed view of Brooke wearing her expensive silk robe. The boardroom fell dead silent as the high-quality audio feed kicked in. Every single person in the room clearly heard her cheerful humming as she retrieved the dark amber prescription bottle from her pocket. The sharp, rhythmic sound of the ceramic pestle grinding heavy sedatives into a fine powder echoed off the walls. Murmurs of profound disgust rippled down the long table as the video showed her carefully scraping the toxic dust into my steaming cup of chamomile tea. I let the footage play out, forcing everyone to watch her stir the poison into the dark liquid with a practiced, chillingly casual grace. They were not just trying to steal my life's work, I announced, my voice carrying the heavy resonant timbre of absolute authority. They were systematically waging chemical warfare against my mind. Every single night, they fed me a highly toxic cocktail of heavy sedatives and powerful hallucinogens. They intentionally engineered the severe symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. They wanted to slowly destroy my cognitive functions so they could stand in this exact room today, shed fake tears, and legally strip away my human rights. Brooke leapt from her chair, her perfectly manicured facade entirely shattered. Her voice was shrill, echoing with the raw, uncontrolled panic of a cornered animal. "It is a lie," she shrieked, pointing a violently shaking finger at the screens. He fabricated this entire presentation. Those videos are digitally altered deepfakes. He hired hackers to manipulate the corporate network and create fake offshore accounts. He is insane. You all heard him. He called me by his dead wife's name yesterday. He is completely losing his mind. Derek eagerly jumped onto her desperate lifeline, pushing himself away from the glass wall. "He is paranoid and completely delusional," Derek shouted, slamming his hand against the mahogany table in a pathetic attempt to reclaim the dominant position. "He is the one who has been secretly moving money, and now he is trying to frame me because his diseased brain cannot handle the reality of his own crimes. You cannot possibly believe this manufactured garbage." The chaotic uproar of the board members threatened to consume the room. Several executives were shouting questions, demanding immediate legal intervention, and calling for corporate security to lock down the building. I simply raised my hand, a gesture I had used for decades to silence crowded rooms, and the seasoned executives instinctively obeyed, falling quiet. I did not raise my voice to match my son's pathetic screaming. I simply reached back into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I tossed it onto the polished wood, sliding it down the long table until it stopped directly in front of the chief medical officer of our corporate insurance division. I did not rely solely on hidden cameras. I stated calmly, keeping my eyes locked onto Derek. When my son forced me into a vehicle yesterday morning, intending to drag me to a bribed psychiatrist, I faked a severe cardiac event. We were redirected to the emergency room at Chicago General Hospital. While I was under their care, I ordered a comprehensive, highly specialized toxicology screening. I bypassed my usual physician to ensure the results could never be intercepted or altered by anyone in this room. The medical chief tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the certified laboratory results. He looked up, his face grim and entirely pale. He announced to the silent room that the blood work unequivocally confirmed the presence of highly concentrated sedating agents and synthetic hallucinogens exactly matching the crushed pills shown in the kitchen surveillance footage. The undeniable medical proof landed like a physical blow. The room instantly turned against Derek and Brooke. The board members pushed their chairs back, physically distancing themselves from the two monsters standing at the front of the room. The chief legal counsel pulled out his cellular phone, quietly instructing his team to immediately freeze all executive access protocols and summon federal authorities to the building. Brooke collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with genuine terrified sobs as the reality of her impending federal prison sentence finally washed over her. But Derek refused to surrender. The crushing weight of absolute defeat fractured his mind, stripping away any remaining trace of rational thought. He glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. His chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You think you are so brilliant, old man," he snarled, his voice dropping into a vicious, guttural sneer that echoed through the tense silence. "You actually think exposing these minor financial accounts and a few sleeping pills will ever save your precious empire from the people I work for?" Derek leaned heavily over the massive mahogany table, a twisted, victorious smile breaking forcefully through his absolute panic. He genuinely believed his darkest, most truly unforgivable violent crime was still completely hidden from the entire world. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. His voice dripped with pure malice as he delivered what he thought was his final untouchable defense. "You have absolutely zero proof of the insurance fraud," he taunted loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard his twisted logic. "Maya is dead. We buried her." The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his statement hung suspended in the chilled air of the boardroom. Derek stood there, chest puffed out, breathing heavily through his nose, completely blinded by his own toxic hubris. He was so incredibly focused on defeating me that he had entirely failed to realize what he had just loudly confessed in a room filled with 30 highly intelligent corporate executives. He had just proudly admitted to orchestrating a catastrophic insurance fraud and burying a human body to cover his tracks. The senior board members did not merely gasp. They physically recoiled from the table, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated horror. The chief financial officer, who had known Derek since he was a young boy, covered his mouth with a trembling hand, staring at my son, as if he had suddenly morphed into a hideous, unrecognizable monster. Brooke, however, realized the fatal error instantly. Her dark eyes widened to the size of saucers, and she lunged forward, desperately grabbing the sleeve of his tailored jacket, trying to pull him back, trying to silence the catastrophic flow of his words. But it was far too late. The damage was permanently and irrevocably done. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of the searing rage burning inside my chest. I simply maintained my calm, unrelenting gaze, watching the precise moment his perceived victory began to crumble into dust. "You are entirely correct about one thing, Derek," I stated, my voice completely smooth and dangerously low, cutting effortlessly through the panicked murmurs erupting around the mahogany table. The innocent, vulnerable woman that Brooke maliciously hunted down in the cold streets and heavily sedated was indeed burned alive in that horrific manufactured crash. We did bury a body. We did stand over a grave. But you severely underestimated my reach, and you vastly overestimated your own intelligence. Before Derek could formulate a response, before his panicked mind could even begin to process the profound implication of my words, a sharp, heavy sound shattered the chaotic tension in the room. The massive double wooden doors at the far end of the boardroom did not merely open, they were forcefully thrown wide open, slamming heavily against the interior walls. The entire room spun around in unison. Two towering men stepped across the threshold, their expressions carved from solid granite. They wore dark, sharply tailored suits, their federal badges gleaming brightly under the recessed ceiling lights. They were heavily armed, moving with a synchronized, predatory, tactical precision that instantly commanded absolute compliance from every single person present. The chief legal counsel immediately lowered his cellular phone, silently stepping back to allow the federal authorities unrestricted access to the room. The two agents took up positions on either side of the wide doorway, their sharp eyes scanning the executives before locking directly onto Derek and Brooke. The room fell so incredibly quiet that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. And then a third figure slowly stepped through the open doorway, stepping directly into the bright, revealing light of the boardroom. A collective breath-stealing shockwave rolled violently through the gathered executives. Derek physically jerked backward, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping against the carpet. He slammed violently into the cold glass wall of the boardroom, his breath leaving his lungs in a harsh, ragged wheeze. He raised his trembling hands, pressing his palms against the thick glass, as if desperately trying to push himself through the solid pane to escape the impossible phantom standing before him. Brooke let out a piercing, ear-splitting shriek of pure, unadulterated terror, her knees buckling instantly. She collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor, clutching her head, sobbing hysterically, as she stared at the terrifying ghost she believed she had murdered 6 months ago. But it was not a ghost. It was Maya. She stood in the center of the doorway, absolutely radiant and undeniably alive. She was wearing a simple, elegant, dark dress that clearly accentuated the beautiful, undeniable curve of her 8-month pregnancy. She did not look like a frightened, defeated victim. She stood with her shoulders pulled back, her chin held high, radiating a quiet, invincible strength that completely dominated the massive room. In her right hand, she held a thick, tightly bound legal folio. It was the original signed and fully notarized confession from the mechanic detailing every single horrific aspect of the murder and the subsequent insurance fraud, perfectly corroborated by the wiretap recordings Garrett had captured. Maya took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes locked entirely on the man who had brutally orchestrated her fiery execution. Derek was hyperventilating his chest, heaving violently, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "You are dead," Derek whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "I saw the police reports. I saw the dental records. You cannot be here. You are dead." Maya did not shout. She did not scream. She spoke with a calm, devastating clarity that pierced directly through his cowardly delusions. "The woman you murdered is dead," Derek, Maya replied, her voice echoing with a profound, sorrowful weight. "An innocent life was stolen because of your insatiable, sickening greed. But I survived. Richard found me. Richard protected me. And together we have spent the last 6 months watching you dig your own federal grave." She walked forward and placed the thick legal folio directly onto the polished mahogany table, sliding it precisely toward the 2 waiting federal agents. "This is the complete sworn testimony of the man you paid to sever my brake lines," she announced to the silent room. "It includes the routing numbers of the offshore accounts you used to pay him the burner phone records, and his detailed account of how Brooke procured the biological collateral you so callously bragged about just moments ago." The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a heavy set of cold steel handcuffs from his black tactical belt. He approached Derek, reciting the federal Miranda warning with a cold, mechanical precision that signaled the absolute end of my son's reign of terror. 2 more agents swiftly entered the room, immediately pulling a hysterically sobbing Brooke up from the floor, securing her wrists tightly behind her back. Derek did not resist. He could not even resist. His entire fabricated reality had imploded, leaving nothing but an empty, terrifying void. He slowly turned his head away from the federal agents, his wide, tear-filled eyes seeking mine in a final pathetic plea for a salvation he completely failed to deserve. I slowly reached down and adjusted the gleaming silver cufflinks on my tailored charcoal suit, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I walked around the massive mahogany table, stopping just inches from his pale, trembling face. "You called me a clueless old man," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable finality as the heavy steel cuffs snapped firmly and securely around his wrists. "But this old man just seized your accounts, saved his grandchild, and bought you a one-way ticket to a miserable federal prison cell." The sharp, metallic sound of the steel handcuffs engaging signaled the absolute end of Derek's orchestrated charade. As the federal agents tightened their grip, dragging him toward the exit, the entire posture of my son underwent a horrifying metamorphosis. The arrogance that had defined him for years evaporated, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched desperation that echoed through the glass-walled boardroom. He stopped struggling against the agents, planting his feet and turning his head back toward me with eyes wide and wild. "Dad, you have to listen to me," he screamed, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated fear. "You know how they operate. You have seen how they dispose of loose ends. If I walk into a general population cell, I am as good as dead. They will not wait for a trial. They will get to me before the first sunset. Please, I am your blood. Use your influence. Call the district attorney. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Do not let them do this to me." I did not flinch. I did not soften my gaze. I watched him struggle, his expensive suit becoming disheveled as the agents firmly steered him toward the double doors. Brooke, who had been completely catatonic with shock, began to wail, her voice a shrill, incoherent plea for mercy that grated against the silence of the room. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my presence casting a long, dark shadow over the space where Derek had stood only moments before. You speak of blood, Derek, I said, my voice cold and steady, carrying the chilling weight of a final judgment. You speak of the cartel as if you were a victim of their cruelty rather than the primary architect of your own demise. You made your bed, son. Now lie in it. I watched the color drain from his face as the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He finally understood that there was no reprieve, no hidden master plan to save him, and no father left to manipulate. The agents efficiently pulled them through the double doors, the heavy wood swinging shut behind them, effectively erasing the two most poisonous elements of my life from the room. The boardroom did not return to its previous state. The air felt lighter, cleansed of the suffocating predatory tension that had dominated the atmosphere for months. The chairman of the board, a man who had served alongside me since the early days of Harrison Logistics, stood up slowly. He looked around the room, acknowledging the stunned faces of his peers, before turning his gaze toward me. It is clear that we have been victims of a massive coordinated internal deception, he declared, his voice firm and resonant. We have all been misled by a calculated campaign of falsehoods designed to isolate Richard and dismantle this firm from the inside. He paused, looking at the empty space where Derek had stood. I propose an immediate vote of no confidence in the acting administration. I move to strip Derek of all executive authority and immediately reinstate Richard Harrison as the sole chairman and chief executive officer of Harrison Logistics. The motion was seconded before he had even finished his final syllable. The vote was unanimous. There was no hesitation, no debate, and no dissent. My return to power was not a negotiation. It was a total restoration of the natural order. I walked to the head of the mahogany table, reclaiming my seat, with a slow, deliberate movement that commanded the absolute attention of every person present. In the months that followed, the legal machinery moved with a crushing, unrelenting momentum. Federal investigators systematically dismantled the cartel connections that Derek had so foolishly fostered. The seized assets, which Derek believed were his ticket to power, became the cornerstone of the government's case against him. Every offshore account, every shell company, and every illicit contract was dragged into the light of the federal courtroom. Derek and Brooke were not just facing charges of fraud. They were facing the reality of life sentences in a high-security federal penitentiary. They were entirely exposed, stripped of their wealth, their influence, and their desperate hope for a secret rescue. The cartel, recognizing that Derek was now a dangerous liability who had compromised their regional operations, made no move to intervene. He was not a valuable asset to be saved. He was a liability to be scrubbed from the record. I spent my time ensuring that Harrison Logistics remained a fortress. I personally vetted every senior executive, implemented rigorous internal transparency protocols, and established a specialized department dedicated solely to corporate security and internal integrity. The firm was leaner, stronger, and fundamentally more resilient than it had ever been. Most importantly, I watched Maya flourish. She had returned to the estate, moving into the quiet, sun-drenched wing of the mansion that once belonged to my late wife. We spent our evenings in the library, looking over the blueprints for the future of the company and preparing for the arrival of my grandchild. The shadows that had haunted this house for so long had finally been banished by the light of the truth. I had destroyed the kingdom Derek tried to build, but in its place I had secured a future that was actually worth preserving. My legacy was no longer a hollow promise to a traitorous heir. It was a promise kept to the only person who truly deserved it. Greed is a poison that blinds you to the strength of the people you underestimate. My son thought my age made me weak, confusing my love and patience for ignorance. But true power isn't about being loud or ruthless. It is about absolute control, knowing when to stay silent and knowing exactly when to strike. Let this be a warning. Never mistake a father's quiet nature for a lack of sight. When you force a good man into a corner, you don't break him, you simply force him to burn your kingdom to the ground, to protect what truly matters. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Share your story down in the comments below. If you loved watching this father serve absolute justice, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss our next gripping story.